It's Aaron Bolmy here. Serving as military specialist for Carleton County, I'm going to give you the next presentation on the World War II timeline. This is the Battle of Hong Kong. What we'll be talking about tonight is the first time Canadian troops are actually on the field of battle. For um, the first time on the land, the Canadians are going to be actually physically defending in combat against an enemy force, and it's going to be the Japanese. Canada, of course, was at war since September 10th, 1939, when Nazi Germany certainly invaded Poland. And then you have, of course, 2 days later, well, 3 days later, September 3rd, 1939, the British and the French declaring war on Nazi Germany. Of course, so 7 days later, Canada declared war on Nazi Germany. And Canada was at war and assisting the British in the Battle of the Atlantic in fighting the Nazis on the wide open ocean of the Atlantic. But it wasn't until December 8th, 1941, that everything was going to change. I mean, they had a small contingent that was shipped to a British colony at Hong Kong, and that was in November 1941. And the British asked us to send the our contingent of soldiers. Yes, they were considered undertrained, maybe even under-equipped, but they were good soldiers. They were Canadian. They were our soldiers. And this was in November of 1941. Canada sent 1,975 troops to help garrison the British colony of Hong Kong. Although dispatched as part of a plan to deter Japanese aggression, the Canadians were not fully equipped and still undergoing training. On December 7th, as the presentation I just last did, of course, the Americans were attacked by the Japanese. Everything changed. The Japanese began major invasions of the Philippines, and then, of course, also Hong Kong. Now Canadian troops are standing in their way. Japan entered the war with a series of successful offensives in Asia and across the Pacific Ocean. The Japanese invaded Hong Kong on December 8th, overran the meager defenses in 17 days. 17 days. In their first land engagement of the war, Canadian troops fought valiantly in a vicious, unequal struggle. Losses were heavy: 290 killed in action and hundreds wounded. The survivors were all taken prisoner, suffering from malnutrition and disease, overwork, and brutality. Nearly 300 more Canadians died in captivity. And this is going to be the gist of that story. Hong Kong, of course, was part of the Republic of China. And of course, the Japanese were on the cusp, ready to invade it as soon as, of course, the war had begun. December 8th was, of course, when the great speech from FDR of the attack that will live in infamy. And that speech was the declaring of the state of war on Imperial Japan. Soon after, of course, Nazi Germany declared war on America. And, of course, America is ready to take on both the Germans and the Japanese. So finally, the last big country is in this war. And that truly is now a world war. So Canada, of course, in 1939, we were in the war, but the Canadian Army saw little action in the early years of the conflict. For one thing, Canada's military was small and unprepared for war. British Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King was also cautious about committing the country to battle. After the heavy bloodletting and the domestic divisions of the First World War, King was wary of sending large numbers of soldiers to fight overseas, something that might require conscription and reignite conflict between French and English-speaking Canadians, which it did in the First World War. Instead, King sought other ways for Canada to help the war effort, such as making armaments, growing food and training air crews under the new British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which had helped the British in the Battle of Britain. We had Canadians that had been fighting over there as pilots. The Royal Canadian Navy had been involved in the Battle of Atlantic, of course, had been using their destroyer escorts, Flower class corvettes, to uh, guide convoys coming out from St. John's, Newfoundland, and of course Halifax Harbour to England. Um, Vital supply lines coming from Australia, New Zealand, the Horn of Africa, all the way up through from Canada and the major British colonies to United Kingdom in the life of supplies, the life of the country, and the Germans were kind of course, shut that off. Despite growing pressure among English Canadians for a greater role, um, they did not want the British. Our army, sorry, was not heavily engaged yet. So, in 1941, when Britain made a request for Canadian troops to help bolster its remote Asian colony of Hong Kong, the King government agreed to send 2 battalions overseas for what it assumed would be merely garrison duty. Of course, this is in Hong Kong in November 1941. Japan had been waging war in China since 1937, and of course Manchuria since 1931. I mean, it had been a long, bloody campaign, um, but it avoided open hostilities against the West. By 1940, the British were fighting for several survival against Germany. Sorry, they realized that defending Hong Kong would be virtually impossible if the colony and other Asian possessions were attacked by Japan. Even so, Britain decided that a show of force might deter any possible Japanese aggression, and it sought troops to reinforce the British and Indian units already garrisoned in Hong Kong. A lot of this data comes from veterans.gc.ca from the Canadian government. It's very good. I love this page and what it has to offer, and so this is why I wanted to use this for this presentation in talking points and some major talking points. So this is Hong Kong. You can see here of where the Japanese, the 230th Infantry Regiment on December 8th, 228th Infantry Regiment, and then of course 229th here, and they're pushing in and taking positions against the Winnipeg Grenadiers, and these units here. This is just the overshow of how the Japanese push in through and cut off Canadian supplies and reinforcements. So the Royal Rifles of Canada are among this. So of course, West Brigade, 2 companies of Middlesex Elements, Winnipeg Grenadiers, Hong Kong Volunteer Defense Corps, and the East Brigade, 2 companies, First Middlesex Royal Rifles of Canada, Hong Kong Volunteers Defense Corps, and so um, this is the topography. Ground over 50 meters here, ground over 150 meters, and the darkest beige is ground over 300 meters. So this is the red line is the approximate British front line at times indicated. So here and here, um, these times are indicated. Now, I can't necessarily read. These are like the 10th, the 12th, 13th December and onward, and 18th, 19th. This is 18th, 19th December, um, and onward. So it was basically over by December 25th on my birthday, um, many years before I was born, of course. Here is so this is here the Japanese line of advance here, the blue lines. So yeah, uh, In the Second World War, Canadian soldiers first engaged in battle defending the British Crown colony of Hong Kong against Japanese invasion. The Canadians at Hong Kong fought against overwhelming odds and displayed the courage of seasoned veterans. Though most had limited military training, they had virtually no chance of victory, but refused to surrender until they were overrun by the enemy. Those who survived the battle became prisoners of war, and many endured torture and starvation by their Japanese captors. In October 1941, the Royal Rifles of Canada and the Winnipeg Grenadiers were ordered to prepare for service in the Pacific, and that's where they were going. From a national perspective, the choice of battalions was ideal. The Royal Rifles were a bilingual unit from the Quebec City area, and together with the Winnipeg Grenadiers, both battalions represented eastern and western regions of Canada. Command of the Canadian force was assigned to Brigadier General J. K. Lawson. This was also a good choice because of Lawson's training and experience. He was a permanent force officer and had been serving as Director of Military Training in Ottawa. The Canadian contingent was comprised of roughly 1,975 soldiers, which also included 2 medical officers, 2 nursing sisters, 2 officers of the Canadian Dental Corps with their assistants, 3 chaplains, 2 auxiliary service officers, and a detachment of the Canadian Postal Corps. There was also 1 military stowaway who was sent back to Canada. This is Brigadier General Lawson here, and certainly he is well known as the commander of operations at Hong Kong, and so his name will go down, and it does, in history. Prior to duty in Hong Kong, the Royal Rifles had served in Newfoundland and St. John, New Brunswick, while the Winnipeg Grenadiers had been posted to Jamaica. In these locations, both battalions had received only minimal training. In late 1941, war with Japan was not considered imminent, and it was expected that the Canadians would see only garrison, non-combat duty. Instead, in December, the Japanese military launched a series of attacks: Pearl Harbour, of course, northern Malaya and Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and Hong Kong. The Royal Rifles and the Winnipeg Grenadiers would find themselves engulfed in hand-to-hand combat against the Japanese, the 38th Division. The defense of Hong Kong was made at great human cost. Approximately 290 Canadian soldiers were killed in battle, and while in captivity, approximately 264 more died as POWs, for a total death toll of 554. In addition, almost 500 Canadians were wounded. Of the 1,975 Canadians who went to Hong Kong, more than 1,050 were either killed or wounded. This was a casualty rate of more than 50%, arguably one of the highest casualty rates of any Canadian theater of action in the Second World War. The British Crown colony of Hong Kong consisted of Hong Kong Island and the adjacent mainland areas of Kowloon and the New Territories. The region is very mountainous, with a total area of about 1,060 square kilometers. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and his chiefs of staff recognized that, in the event of a war with Japan, it would be impossible to hold Hong Kong. Churchill and his army chiefs designated Hong Kong an outpost, and initially decided against sending more troops to the colony. In September 1941, however, they reversed their decision and argued that additional reinforcements would provide a military deterrent against the Japanese and reassure Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek that Britain was genuinely interested in defending the colony. Canada was asked to provide 1 or 2 battalions for that purpose. The Royal Rifles of Canada and the Winnipeg Grenadiers sailed from Vancouver on October 27, 1941, aboard the Awatia, escorted by HMCS Prince Robert. The Canadians arrived in Hong Kong on November 16th. However, the 212 vehicles assigned to the force being transported on board the freighter Don Joes never did reach Hong Kong. The ship had only just reached Manila when the war with Japan began, and the United States forces were given approval to use the Canadian equipment in the defense of the Philippines. To defend the colony, General C. M. Maltby had only a total force of some 14,000 soldiers and had token number of naval and air force personnel. Along with the Canadians, the military force included the 8th and the 12th Coast Regiments, the 5th Anti-Aircraft Regiment of the Royal Artillery, the 1st Hong Kong Regiment, the Hong Kong and Singapore Royal Artillery, the 965th Defense Battery, RA, Royal Artillery, and the 22nd and 40th Fortress Companies, Royal Engineers. Most of these units were military personnel from either India or China. There was one battalion of British infantry, the 2nd Battalion, Royal Scots, one British machine gun battalion, the 1st Battalion, Middlesex Regiment, the two Indian infantry battalions, the 5th Battalion, 7th Rajput Regiment, and the 2nd Battalion, 14th Punjab Regiment. The Indian and Chinese soldiers accounted for 35% of the entire force. The colony had no significant air or naval defense. The Kai Tak Royal Air Force (RAF) base at Hong Kong had only 5 airplanes, 2 Walrus amphibians, and 3 Vickers Vildebesti torpedo bombers, flown and serviced by 7 officers and 108 airmen. An earlier request for a fighter squadron had been rejected, and the nearest fully operational RAF base was in Kota Baru in Malaya, nearly 2,250 kilometers away. Hong Kong also lacked adequate naval defense. All major naval vessels had been withdrawn, and only one destroyer, HMS Thracian, several gunboats, and a flotilla of motor torpedo boats remained. The arrival of the Canadians changed the plans for the defense of the colony. The original strategy had been called for the main defense to be on the island, with only one infantry battalion deployed on the mainland for demolition duties and for delaying purposes. The 2 additional battalions enabled General Maltby to assign 3 battalions to the mainland. These battalions would fight from the gin drinkers line. So the gin drinkers line, the 18 kilometers of defenses stretched across the rugged hill country and stubbed with trenches and pillboxes, concrete bunkers. It was hoped that these additional battalions would protect Kowloon, Victoria Harbour, Lai Mun Passage, and the northern areas of Hong Kong Island from artillery fire that was launched from the mainland. If the enemy launched a major offensive, the mainland battalions would be ordered to complete demolitions, clear vital supplies, and sink any remaining ships in the harbor so they would not fall into enemy hands. The remaining forces on Hong Kong Island were to prepare against any Japanese attack from the sea. The mainland brigade, commanded by Brigadier C. Wallace, was composed of the Royal Scots and the 2 Indian battalions. The Canadian signal section was allotted to this brigade. The Island Brigade under Brigadier Lawson consisted of the 2 Canadian battalions and the Middlesex Regiment. The Canadian units facing the sea were assigned the task of defending the island's beaches as their primary role, while the Middlesex Regiment or unit had the task of holding the system of pillboxes around the island. During the 3 weeks between their arrival and the outbreak of war, the Canadians stationed on the mainland engaged in intensive training on the island to familiarize themselves with the ground they would be defending. Although the preparation was for beach defense, the reconnaissance and exercises provided some knowledge of the difficult terrain and would later prove valuable against the enemy. Through late November and early December, life in the colony went along as usual. Reports of Japanese troops massing to the north of the Chinese border continued to be reported, but there had been many false alarms, and an air of optimism prevailed. As late as December 7th, a report of Japanese concentrations in the area was described as certainly exaggerated and deliberately fostered by the Japanese. The next day, the Japanese attacked Hong Kong. The Japanese attack did not take the garrison by complete surprise. The defense forces were prepared. On the morning of December 7th, the entire garrison was ordered to war stations. The Canadian force was ferried across from Kowloon to the island, and by 5 p.m., the battalions were in position, and Brigadier Lawson's headquarters was set up at Wang Nai Chung Gap in the middle of the island. 15 hours before the Japanese attacked, all Hong Kong defensive forces were in position. On December 8th, 8 a.m., the Japanese aircraft attacked the Kai Tak airport and easily damaged or destroyed the few aircraft of the Royal Air Force. The early empty camp at Shem Shui Pool was the next target, where 2 men of the Royal Canadian Signals were wounded. There were the first Canadian casualties in Hong Kong. That same morning, the Japanese ground forces moved across the frontier of the new territories and met resistance from the forward forces of the mainland brigade. In the face of the strong enemy pressure, these advanced units fell back to the gin drinkers' line. The defenders hoped to defend the line for a week or more, but on December 9th, the Japanese captured Shunmun Redoubt on an area of high ground and the most important strategic position on the left flank of the gin drinkers' line. The Japanese had launched their attack under cover of darkness, and there was fierce fighting. But in the end, the Japanese were victorious. Their victory at night revealed how General Maltby had completely underestimated his enemy. In a dispatch, he had noted that Japanese night work was poor, but within hours of their first attack, Shunmin Redoubt was in enemy hands. On December 10th, D Company of the Winnipeg Grenadiers was dispatched to strengthen the remaining defenders on the mainland. On December 11th, this company exchanged gunfire with the enemy and became the first Canadian Army unit to engage in combat in the Second World War. First Canadian unit. Further Japanese attacks followed. The gin drinkers' line could no longer be held. Midday on December 11th, General Maltby ordered the mainland troops to withdraw from the mainland. The Winnipeg Grenadiers covered the Royal Scots' withdrawal down the Kowloon Peninsula. The Punjab units moved at night, and the Rajputs, who had been left to guard Devil's Peak, followed. The evacuation was successful, and most of the brigade's heavy equipment was saved. On December 13th, a Japanese demand for the surrender of Hong Kong was categorically rejected. On the island, the defending forces were reorganized into an East and West Brigade. The West Brigade, commanded by Brigadier Lawson, consisted of the Royal Scots, the Winnipeg Grenadiers, the Punjab unit, and the Canadian Signalers. The East Brigade, under Brigadier Wallace, comprised the Royal Rifles of Canada and the Rajput unit. The Middlesex Regiment was directly under General Maltby's command at Fortress Headquarters. The Canadian battalions were divided, and the Royal Rifles were no longer under Brigadier Lawson's command. But ironically, both Canadian units were still charged with defending the southern beaches, where General Maltby mistakenly feared a seaborne attack. This is Brigadier General Cedric Wallace. and he's in command of the East Brigade. Okay, so he's in command, and of course their overall commander, Major General Maltby, and that's him here. He's in command. He's GOC HK, talking to Brigadier General Lawson, commanding officer of the Canadian Forces. The boundary between the brigades ran just east of the central north-south road across the island. Brigadier Lawson maintained his headquarters at Wong Nai Chung on this key road cutting through the island. Brigadier Wallace established his headquarters at Tai Tam Gap, a central position in the eastern sector. To soften the island's defenses, the Japanese directed heavy artillery bombardment at the island, mounted destructive air raids, and systematically shelled the pillboxes along the north shore. And this here's the mainland positions at Hong Kong. That's the Gin Drinkers line, which you see here. Uh, Shin Mun Redoubt here, and Mong Lai Tong, Hai Wan, and Tai Wan Tsung. These are all the mainland areas I wanted to show. On December 17th, the Japanese repeated their demand for surrender. Once again, it was summarily refused, but the situation was very grim. With the sinking of two British relief ships off Malaya and the crippling of the United States fleet at Pearl Harbor, there was no hope of relief, and the Chinese armies were in no position to give immediate aid. The defenders awaited assault in complete isolation. Brigadier Wallace visited the Rajput Regiment's headquarters on December 18th and wrongfully assured the Indian military personnel that the Japanese would not attack. Like General Maltby, he grossly underestimated the fighting ability of the Japanese. The invasion came with nightfall on December 18th. The enemy launched four separate amphibious assaults across the 3-kilometer front on the northern beaches of Hong Kong Island. They came ashore in the face of machine gun fire from soldiers of the Rajput unit who were manning the pillboxes. From the shore, the Japanese forces fanned out to the east and west and advanced up the valleys leading to high ground. The Royal Rifles engaged the invading Japanese and tried to push them back. C Company of the Royal Rifles, in reserve in an area adjacent to the landing, counterattacked throughout the nightfall, suffering and inflicting heavy casualties. Other platoons of the Royal Rifles went into action on the west side of Mount Parker and suffered many casualties from the already entrenched enemy. The strength of the invasion force was overwhelming, and by early December 19th the Japanese had reached as far as the Wong Nai Chung and Tai Tam Gaps, again proving their effectiveness at night fighting. With the East Brigade, with the enemy well established on the high hills from Mount Parker to Jardine's Lookout, General Maltby ordered the East Brigade to withdraw southward towards Stanley Peninsula, where it was hoped a counterattack could be made. By nightfall on December 19th, a new defensive line was established from Palm Villa to Stanley Mound, and a brigade headquarters was set up at Stone Hill. Unfortunately, some valuable mobile artillery was destroyed during the withdrawal. Even worse, vital communications were severed between the East and West brigades when the advancing Japanese reached the sea at Repulse Bay. The brigade was now seriously reduced in numbers, with the Rajput battalion being virtually wiped out defending the northern beaches. The East Brigade consisted of the Royal Rifles, some companies of the Volunteer Defence Corps, and some Middlesex machine gunners. The Royal Rifles were exhausted, deprived of hot meals for several days. They had to catch whatever sleep they could in the weapons pits, which they were continuously manning. Yet during the next 3 days these men valiantly drove northward over the rugged, mountainous terrain to join with the West Brigade to clear the Japanese from the high peaks. This is great footage from King and Country. Great documentary series with from Norm Christie. It's really good, very accurate information. First, they attempted a thrust along the shore of Repulse Bay in the hope of reaching Wong Nei Chung Gap and the West Brigade. They managed to drive the enemy out of an area along the Repulse Bay Hotel. However, they were unable to dislodge the Japanese from the surrounding hill positions and were forced to withdraw. One company of the Royal Rifles was left to hold this area, and a renewed effort to break through was made on December 21st. Next came an attempt to reach Wong Nai Chung by a more easterly route, despite heavily enemy opposition south of Tai Tam Tuk Reservoir. The Royal Rifles succeeded in driving the Japanese out of a number of hill positions and destroyed a group holding the crossroads south of the reservoir. And this is one of the men that was there.
60 years later, Alfred Babin returns to St. Stephen's.
Again, the attack could not be maintained. The companies had become separated and they were out of mortar ammunition. The enemy was still pushing, and Brigadier Wallace decided to withdraw his men to the former positions. Fighting at Repulse Bay continued, but despite a valiant effort, the defenders had to be withdrawn. After December 21st, no further attempts were made to drive northward, for the troops were depleted and exhausted, and the Japanese, who had been reinforced, mounted constant attacks. At noon on December 22nd, the Japanese took Sugarloaf Hill, but volunteers from the Royal Rifles C Company went forward, and by nightfall they had recaptured the hill. Another company, however, was driven from Stanley Mound. On the evening of December 23rd, orders were given for a general withdrawal to Stanley Peninsula. The exhausted Royal Rifles were taken out to Stanley Fort, well down the peninsula, for a rest. However, they were soon recalled for action as the Japanese were making advances which the Volunteer Defense Corps and other available troops could not contain. The Royal Rifles celebrated Christmas Day, 1941, by returning to battle. Brigadier Wallace ordered a counterattack to regain ground lost the night before. D Company was successful in this mission but suffered heavy casualties. The West Brigade. So the West Brigade, the Winnipeg Grenadiers, had also been thrust swiftly into action with the West Brigade. On December 18th, the brigade consisted of the Winnipeg Grenadiers, the Royal Scots in reserve in the Wang Chai Gap Mount Parish area, the Punjab Battalion in Victoria City, and a company of the Middlesex around Leighton Hill. Charged with covering the southwest and west coasts of the island, the Grenadiers established their headquarters at Wan Chai Gap. Their D Company was back in brigade reserve at Wong Nai Chung to be ready for action at a moment's notice. Flying columns were organized from the headquarters company and were billeted just south of Wang Chai Gap. When the enemy landed on the evening of December 18th, the flying columns were ordered forward. Two platoons were directed to Jardine's Lookout and Mount Butler, where they engaged the Japanese in intense fighting. Heavily outnumbered, they were cut to pieces and both platoon commanders were killed. Early in the morning of the 19th, A Company of the Grenadiers were ordered to clear Jardine's Lookout and push on to Mount Butler. Reports of its action were confused. So many officers and men became casualties, but it apparently became divided and part of the company, led by Company Sergeant Major CSM J.R. Osborne, drove through to Mount Butler and captured the top of the hill. A few hours later, a heavy counterattack forced this party back where it rejoined the rest of the company. Then, while attempting to withdraw, the whole force was surrounded. The Japanese began to throw grenades into the defensive positions occupied by A Company of the Grenadiers, and CSM Osborne caught several and threw them back. Finally, one fell where he could not retrieve it in time. Osborne shouted a warning and threw himself upon the grenade as it exploded, giving his life for his comrades. Shortly afterwards, the Japanese rushed the position, and A Company's survivors became prisoners. At the end of the war, CSM J.R. Osborne was awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross. As stated in the following London Gazette citation, John Robert Osborne is a recipient of the Victoria Cross. This medal is awarded for the most conspicuous bravery, a daring or preeminent act of valor, or self-sacrifice or extreme devotion to duty in the presence of the enemy. Victoria Cross, Second World War, 1939-1945. And that's John Robert Osborne. And he was awarded that for and awarded it posthumously in the Battle of Hong Kong. As the Japanese approached the West Brigade headquarters, Brigadier Lawson decided to withdraw to a new location. However, before the action was completed, the headquarters was surrounded. A company of Royal Scots attempted to provide assistance, but less than a dozen were able to get through. About 10 a.m. on December 19th, Brigadier Lawson reported to Fortress headquarters that he was going outside to fight it out with the enemy, who were firing into the shelter at point-blank range. He left the bunker with a pistol in each hand to take on the massed enemy, losing his life in the effort. After Brigadier Lawson's death and that of Colonel Hennessy, who was next in command, West Brigade was without a commander until Colonel H.B. Rose of the Hong Kong Defense Corps was appointed on December 20th. Meanwhile, D Company of the Grenadiers held on firmly to its position near Wong Nai Chung Gap, denying the Japanese use of one of the main north-south road across the island. The Grenadiers inflicted severe casualties on the enemy and delayed Japanese advances for 3 days. They held out until the morning of December 22nd, when ammunition, food, and water were exhausted, and the Japanese had blown in the steel shutters of the company shelters. Only then did they surrender. Inside were 37 wounded grenadiers. The final phase of the fighting on the western part of the island consisted of a brave attempt to maintain a continuous line from Victoria Harbour to the south shore. The Winnipeg Grenadiers were sent to hold Mount Cameron, an important height in the line, and they did so despite intensive dive bombing and mortar attacks. On the night of December 22nd, they were forced to retreat as the Japanese once again struck in the darkness. Now, the line consisted of the Middlesex Regiment and the Indian battalions on the left, the Royal Scots on the western slopes of Mount Cameron, and the Grenadiers in the right sector of Bennett's Hill. On the afternoon of December 24th, the left sector fell and the enemy made further gains on Mount Cameron. The Grenadiers held their positions against heavy attacks and on Christmas morning regained some ground lost to Bennett's Hill. However, After a 3-hour truce, the Japanese again attacked. The Allied positions were overrun, and the defenders were forced to surrender. At 3:15 p.m. Christmas Day, General Maltby advised the governor that further resistance was futile. The white flag was hoisted. On the east side of the island, a company was just moving forward for an attack when word of the surrender arrived. After 17 and a half days of fighting, the defense of Hong Kong was over. The battle toughened. Japanese were backed by a heavy arsenal of artillery, total air domination, and the comfort of knowing that reinforcements were available. In contrast, the defending Allies, with only non-combative garrison experience, were exhausted from continual bombardment and had fought without relief or reinforcement. The fact that it took the Japanese until Christmas Day to force surrender is a testimony to the brave resistance of the Canadian and other defending troops. The fighting in Hong Kong ended with immense Canadian casualties, 290 killed and 493 wounded. The death toll and hardship did not end with the surrender. My friend Richard Blacker, his father, survived, but had been prisoner, POW, under the Japanese. Of course, he didn't talk about it much, but it must have been complete hardship. The Japanese did not believe in the Geneva Convention. The Japanese were known to consider all other races besides theirs inferior races, as including the Chinese as well. The inferiority of in that belief in of the Imperial Japanese led to extreme cruelty, malnutrition, torture, such as what they call the oven, which is a tin box that they put soldiers in for, either discipline or whatever, and put them in for 12 hours to days at a time. Many did not survive the cruelty. Under the Japanese, it was worse than the Germans. The Germans, at least, apply the Geneva Convention, except to, of course, Jews and communists. But to the Western Allies, they ran by the Geneva Convention. The Japanese, not at all. Even before the battle had officially ended, Canadians would endure great hardships at the hands of their Japanese captors. On December 24th, the Japanese overran a makeshift hospital in Hong Kong, assaulting and murdering nurses and bayoneting wounded Canadian soldiers in their beds. After the colony surrendered, the cruelty would continue. For more than 3.5 years, the Canadian POWs were imprisoned in Hong Kong and Japan in the foulest of conditions and had to endure brutal treatment and near starvation. In the filthy, primitive POW quarters in northern Japan, they would often work 12 hours a day in mines or on the docks in the cold, subsidizing on rations of 800 calories a day. Subsisting, sorry. Many did not survive. In all, more than 550 of the 1,975 Canadians who sailed from Vancouver in October 1941 never returned. Those Canadians who fought in the defense of Hong Kong sacrificed much in their efforts to help bring peace and freedom to the people of Asia and the Pacific. Their task was a difficult and costly one, but their sacrifice would serve as an example of the kind of effort that would be required to eventually triumph. The survivors' ordeal that followed as prisoners of war served serves as an additional reminder of the great cost of war. These combatants were among the more than 1 million men and women who served in the Canadian Armed Forces during the Second World War. More than 42,000 Canadians gave their lives in the war. Canada and the world recognize the sacrifices and the achievements of all Canadians, like those who fought in the defense of Hong Kong, who accomplished so much and left a lasting legacy of peace.
This memorial bears the names of some 2,000 Canadian volunteers who helped the British defend Hong Kong in World War II.
As I look at my comrades today, aged as I am, I recall the slender youths who sailed across the Pacific in 1941 to encounter a well-trained and battle-hardened foe. How innocent of combat we were, how naive of the horrors of war.
Japan attacked on December 8, 1941. The Canadian soldiers fought a fierce battle, but the Allies were overrun and surrendered on Christmas Day. Close to 300 Canadians were killed. The rest became prisoners of war and suffered torture and slave labor by their Japanese captors for 44 months until the war's end. 269 Canadians died in the camps from disease and malnutrition. Those who survived suffered lasting disabilities. For years, the Hong Kong veterans, in an effort spearheaded by the war amps, fought for compensation and an apology from Japan for the maltreatment and forced labor they endured. In 1998, Canada granted each veteran or their widow an ex gratia payment in recognition of the just basis of their claim. 70 years after the battle, Japan delivered an apology to Canada's Hong Kong veterans for the gross violation of their human rights. Fewer than 60 veterans remained to receive it. But for the greater majority of them, and for their families, it represented a measure of closure. The Hong Kong Veterans Memorial Wall fulfills the promise they made to their fallen comrades, that their sacrifice would never be forgotten.
May we all, from our place in the hereafter, be able to look down upon this marble monument and say, my name is written there. I am remembered.
So that was just showcasing what the war amps and what they'd got as an apology. And then, of course, showing the memorial. The memorial, there's a memorial erected at the Sai Wan Bay War Cemetery on the island of Hong Kong to honor those who have died in its defense. On this memorial made of white granite are inscribed the names of over 2,000 people, 228 of them Canadian, who died in Hong Kong, and who have no known grave, including the name of Company Sergeant Major John Robert Osborne, Winnipeg Grenadiers, who was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. Below, if you look at some of, there's different at the San Juan Bay War Memorial. It slopes down toward the sea with a magnificent view of the coastline and distant hills. There are 283 soldiers of the Canadian Army who are buried, including 107 who are unidentified. Then there's the Stanley Military Cemetery, which is situated just beyond the small fishing village of Stanley in the southern part of Hong Kong Island. And so there are 20 Canadians buried there, including one unknown. This is the Yokohama British Commonwealth War Cemetery here. So the Yokohama British Commonwealth War Cemetery, located in Hodogaya near Yokohama, is the only British Commonwealth cemetery in Japan. Here, 137 Canadian dead, most of whom died as prisoners of war in Japanese internment camps, lie with their New Zealand comrades beneath a cross of sacrifice in one of the 4 sections of the cemetery. So this map here that I've used, it's directed from the History and Heritage Department of National Defense. It depicts the fighting in Hong Kong from December 18th to December 25th. Okay, so now I know. I thought it was a bit earlier. I couldn't read it. It was stretched a bit. The Japanese invaded the island from the mainland to the north in four amphibious assaults, then began pushing south and west to overwhelm the defenders. The Allied forces were organized into an East and West Brigade, of course. So they certainly fought a series of brave defensive stands against a much larger force, much a larger force, and actually far more trained, better trained. So the Commonwealth, what we had are 14,564 troops, 5 planes, 1 destroyer, 4 gunboats, 1 mine layer, and 8 MTBs. So on all this side, so the British Commonwealth, um, this is the British Empire, the British Hong Kong flag. There's our red ensign Canadian flag. Republic of China. These are all the members of the defense of Hong Kong. East India. This is British Rajput East India flag, and then of course the Free French. So we lost the casualties, of course, 2,113 killed or missing in all total. 2,300 wounded, 10,000 captured. 1 destroyer captured, 4 gunboats sunk, 1 mine layer sunk, 3 MTBs sunk, 5 planes lost. 4,000 civilians killed, 3,000 severely wounded. The Japanese had 29,700 troops. So you can see, almost over double. They had 47 aircraft, 1 cruiser, 3 destroyers, 4 gunboats, and 4 torpedo boats and 3 gunboats. They lost 675 killed, 2,079 wounded, and 2 planes damaged. So there certainly was a defeat there, but they fought and they continued to, and that period of time, it's incredible that we were able to hold on that long. Um, so, all right, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That's the presentation on the Battle of Hong Kong.